Neighbor wanted the fence fix, we just removed the fence. This happened to my friend a couple months ago. Him and his wife just moved into their first house about 6 months ago. Then a strong windstorm came through and damaged their fence. And by damaged their fence I mean the fence was now leaning slightly, leaning about 70 degrees, because home insurance won't fix the fence plus it being winter. My friend and his wife were going to wait until spring to hire someone to fix/replace their fence. Well, their backyard neighbor did not like that. The backyard neighbor wanted the fence fix ASAP. When the neighbor found out they were going to wait until spring, the neighbor called the city and complained that their fence was out of code. When the city inspector came out to inspect their fence, it was in fact out of code and needed to be corrected. Now the reason the neighbor was so fixated on the fence being replaced is because the neighbor has a pool in their yard and need to have a fence around their pool for safety. Well, my friend and his wife, now pissed off at their neighbor, decided to only remove the fence and not replace it. This allows them to be in city code, and now when the spring hits, the neighbor is going to need to build a fence on their backside of their yard if they want to fill up their pool for the summer. If the neighbor would have just been nice and not called the city like a Karen, my friend would have built the fence up in the spring, no problem. TLDR. Wind damage friend's fence. Friend was going to fix it in the spring. Backyard neighbor wanted it fixed now and called the city. Friend just removed fence instead, and neighbor has no fence on their backside of yard. Now to the comments. It's hard to live beside some people. I don't blame your friends at all. Somewhat similar story. We have our dogs in a fenced-in yard. Our fence is several feet on our side of the property. He never watches his dog, and his dog would come to the fence and irritate our dogs. They started jumping on the fence and now it's leaning. We wanted to get it fixed as soon as his dog passed, but then he started piling wood up against our fence before we had a chance. The fence that is several feet over our property line, so the wood is on our property. He wanted us to fix the leaning fence because it was making it hard to pile his wood up. The fencing company needs to get on his side of the fence in order to fix it, hence why we kept our fence over on our property line, in case of maintenance. We told him this and his response was, "I'll put my wood wherever I want." He has 8 acres of land and our fence is the furthest place from his house. Then he called the township about our fence. The township came out, saw the markers for the property line and told us to do whatever we wanted with his wood since it was on our property. Can't wait until spring comes. The township came out, saw the markers for the property line and told us to do whatever we wanted with his wood since it was on our property. Post an ad for free wood. It'll be gone before he can even realize what happened. It's so tempting. The funniest part about this is he called the township because the fence was leaning on his property. It wasn't, but his wood was on our property. This is great. Make sure your friend knows to request the neighbor pay for a survey of the property line before fence building starts. This is great advice. I used to own a fence company and know the stories I could tell you about people not actually knowing where the property line is. I once built a fence where I was told, despite recommending the client get a property survey, which they didn't do. The neighbor was ticked and did pay for one, then I had to be paid to come and move the entire fence 1.5 feet backwards. For a 6-foot vinyl fence, it wasn't cheap. My neighbor pulled this with me. He got a permit to drop in a pool, but figured the property line was my fence, and built his fence right up against it. No permit for the fence or the rear of the work he did to the backyard around the pool. Turns out, my fence wasn't on the line and he effectively stole a part of my property with a super quick, non-permitted fence. One call to building inspection later, I got my yard back and took down my fence in that side of the yard to enjoy the extra space with a brand new fence. Also, he paved his entire backyard, and when he finally applied for the permit, he learned he paved too high a percent of his property. He had to get us to sign off that we didn't care when he went in front of the town council for permission to keep it. I felt bad enough about the cost he ate on the fence, and I couldn't care less how many pavers he has in his backyard versus grass. I happily signed his form. I hope the neighbors calls the city to report the pool without fence and possibly make them repair it during the winter. As a former pool owner, that fence rule applies in the winter as well. You could have your friends call the city today and he will have to fix it in a hurry in winter. It's a safety issue and kids can still get stuck in an empty pool. That's even better. Call the same city inspector and request a fence because there is a risk of a not secured pool. Or they have to remove the pool immediately. That would be great. After the fence is removed, you should call the inspectors yourself to report an easily accessible pool. I wouldn't wait till spring. It'll be more money to install a fence in frozen ground. Just getting fencing, depending on your location, is difficult right now. Inventory on everything is low. Wood prices are sky high. We had a fence put in and recommended the company to a neighbor about 6 months later. We put in about 25 feet more than them, and an extra gate. They paid almost $1,500 more than we did because of supply costs. Ha ha. We ended up with a malicious compliance with our back neighbor for something similar to this. Wind blew down a portion of fence between us and nice neighbors. Nice neighbors are on the corner and share their backyard fence with us and nasty neighbor. Nasty neighbor rents to a very sweet lady. The entire fence needed to be replaced. There were portions that were rotted and starting to fall down. We coordinated with nice neighbor and single neighbor on our other side and everyone agreed to share the cost of a new fence. Nasty neighbor refused and said she installed the fence with her dad and she would just fix the parts that needed to be fixed. We told her that wasn't going to fly because the boards were all rotted and the entire thing was falling down and needed to be replaced. We weren't being jerks. We were being reasonable as the fence was 20+ years old and had never been maintained properly. We had only lived there a year at the time. Technically, the fence was right on her property line. Cue the malicious compliance. We marked the property line and the original survey markers and told them to install the fence on our side of the property, leaving her crappy fence up. The boards faced our side, so with the new fence, she would never be able to replace them without taking down everything on her side. At some point, she came out with her husband and they actually looked at the fence and saw what terrible shape it was in. They contacted us, admitted it needed to be replaced, and we came to an agreement on their contribution. I like to think it was a win-win for everyone. I had a nasty neighbor that lived behind us for years. The end of the story is she died at age 102. But for the 15 years prior, she tried to make our life miserable. And if I knew TikTok was gonna be the way it is, I might have recorded some of the shit she did. So, she built her fence in the 70s. She also built it 10 feet inside of her own property. Meaning the property that I bought in the early 2000s has 10 more feet of her property. Seriously, not my problem. I told her that she was welcome to have the fence replaced at the property line. Didn't mind, still don't if a new owner comes along and wants to do it. But I'm not paying to put up a fence on the back of my property that I don't need. Anyway, one time she stood at the back of the fence for several days in a row blasting music in my direction. Now I live on top of a hill and I couldn't really hear it. But the rest of her neighbors did, and one side blasted back heavy metal and neighbors on the other side blasted NPR, all in her direction, so I was super satisfied. The very last day of those shenanigans, and I almost feel bad telling the story because I know she was ducking old. But the last day she did it, she actually climbed over into another neighbor's yard, got naked, set up boom boxes around their yard and then blasted her music in my direction. Naked. Of course, the cops got called, not by me. I didn't even know what was going on, and then she went to the hospital for like 2 weeks. The last time she harassed me before she died was when she hired 2 guys off the street. I don't know where she found them, but they told me that they didn't know her before she gave each a $100 bill and told them to tell me that they were fence inspectors, and that if I did not move the fence myself, they would have me arrested or worse. The second that I laughed at them and said, "Who do you work for? I want their names." They spilled the beans like a ducking drunk carrying beans, lol. That said, non-personal neighbor disputes are a guilty pleasure of mine. I don't even blame the guys on the last part. The $100 was to pretend to be a fencer inspector, not to lie about their employer. It's her own fault for half-assing the fraud.